This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Hi, welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews. Jumping into it, our first question is, there is a woman who can smell people who have Parkinson's. How is that possible?
She does, and it is possible, and people have a little bit of a hint of how she does it. Her name is Joy Milne. She's a delightful grandmother in Scotland. And as you can see here, I actually have no idea if she's delightful, but it feels obligatory to say that she's delightful. And she has an astonishing otherworldly sense of smell where she could pick up diseases in people. And she first noted this years earlier when her husband was in his mid 30s. And one day his characteristic smell had changed and changed in that changed way forever after. And about 10 years later, he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, very early age. She became convinced that the smell she had detected was predictive that he was going to get Parkinson's, that she could smell Parkinson's in people. And of course, as the story goes, she spent a certain amount of time shouting in the wilderness and people paying no attention. And she finally found this physician, Perdita Barron, who said, okay, let's give this lady a test. So they got a bunch of Parkinson's patients and a bunch of controls, and the doctor had all of them wear t-shirts and then collected the t-shirts and cut them up into bits so that they were separate in little jars, and then they gave her a test. They sat her down and she smelled each sample. Do you smell Parkinson's or not? And she correctly identified every single case of Parkinson's, which was flabbergasting. Not only that, they had cut the t-shirts in half so that there were twice as many samples as subjects. And she was able by smell to say, this is the other half of this person's t-shirt. It was that one, the fourth one I smelled, and was completely accurate. She got one false positive, somebody who was a control without Parkinson's disease, where she said, I smell Parkinson's disease. So she was able to do this. And she described one time she went to a Parkinson's clinic working with these doctors, and she was overwhelmed, an entire room full of people smelling of what she said was Parkinson's disease. And an interesting detail came up with that. One of the days, one of the physicians on the project was in the clinic, and a man came up and said, I don't know if you remember me, but I was in that study with that woman who could smell Parkinson's. I was one of the controls. I was the one a year ago where she said, I smell Parkinson's on him. I just got diagnosed with Parkinson's. Whoa. So the question, of course, now becomes, what is the smell? And here there was some serendipity in that in all sorts of studies where they have people smell people's body odors, and that's actually the mainstay of deciding for men if women smell better when they're ovulating. What you do is you have the person wear the t-shirt for a day, and then you cut out the armpits. Or if you're really adventurous, you take cotton swabs and swab the armpits. And fortunately, these doctors decided to have the entire t-shirt being smelled by her, because it turned out the smell, the distinctive smell, was not coming from the armpits. It was coming from like the collar on these shirts. And after a bunch of sleuthing, they figured out the smell was coming from sebaceous glands. Sebaceous glands are microscopic, surrounding the roots of your hair, and they secrete oily wax stuff. They secrete the stuff called sebum. And if you secrete too much and it gets infected, you have seborrhea. It was sebum that was seemingly the source of this. And as it turned out, you got lots of sebaceous glands in your hair, on your face, upper back, and next to nothing in your armpits. So at that point, they rope in some chemists to try to figure out what's in this oily, waxy sebum stuff that was seemingly allowing her to identify the smell. And they threw the big guns at it, this chemistry technique called gas chromatography, mass spectrometry. And just to balance the big analytical guns there. They also had her sitting there next to this machine and sniffing stuff as it went in and saying, yeah, that one smells. That's one of the ones. And what they found was there were three chemicals that she had identified and that the mass spec showed higher levels in samples from Parkinson's patients than samples from controls. And these were really obscure chemicals, hippuric acid, other ones, nobody's ever, octadecanol, three of these at much higher levels in the Parkinson's patients than in the controls. And the study allowed them to eliminate a critical confound. Oh, Parkinson's disease. People with Parkinson's take drugs. Is it possible she was picking up the smell of being medicated rather than the disease itself? Obviously not, because she picked up her husband's smell 10 years in advance. She picked up the smell of this control subject a year in advance, but nonetheless, they were able to show formally whether or not somebody was medicated, which medication they were taking, had no effect on this distinctive chemical profile coming from their sebum. So at this point, we've got two massive questions. First one, how is a disease that is centered in the center of your brain, a brain region called the substantia nigra, where things go very, very wrong in Parkinson's? And we've talked about it at times. How does something going wrong in there make your sebaceous glands in your neck secrete some oily, waxy thing that otherwise almost never happens? So that's the first question. The second is, how is she doing it? So the first question, two possibilities. And at this point, nobody really knows all that much, but the neurons that are beginning to keel over in Parkinson's, their metabolisms get all screwy, especially in their mitochondria, and mitochondria are one of the hot spots for going wrong in Parkinson's disease. And they make all sorts of obscure metabolites that they normally don't, including these three that they had picked up. How it's getting from there to sebaceous glands is still a mystery. The second possibility is they think there might be differences in the microbiome, the microbial stuff on your skin around sebaceous glands in people with Parkinson's disease versus those not. And this is the source of it. With just as puzzling of a question, you got this disease hitting the center of your brain. It's changing the microbiome on your skin. Basically, at this point, they're not clear. So this shifts us to the other big remaining question, which is, how does she do this? How does she possibly do this? Because at this point, they're trying to figure out how to clone her. She should be in every Parkinson's clinic on earth. So it turns out she's got hereditary hyperosmia. She's got this crazy good sense of smell. Her mother had it. Her grandmother had it. And here's her delightful looking Scottish grandmother. And when Joy Milne was a child, her grandmother took her aside and said, you know, for some reason in the family, we have a really good sense of smell, but sometimes keep that to yourself. People don't want to hear this. And it turned out she was sort of taking advantage of this ability all along. She's a nurse. And there's a number of diseases that have distinctive smells. Most famously, when somebody in diabetes is in diabetic ketoacidosis, there's a distinctive smell on their breath. But she apparently for years had been informally guessing people's diagnoses, and this was not all that earth-shaking of news to her. So Joy is a hereditary hyperosmic. What is that about? They have found strange versions in her family or matrilineal line, strange versions of some genes that code for olfactory receptors in the nose. They have found some genes having strange versions that seem to increase the number of neurons in the olfactory cortex that's processing olfactory information going into the brain. So there's at least a couple of hints there. Meanwhile, what's happening with her? She has become this superstar in Parkinson's science. Everybody knows about her. She goes to conferences. She's on the board of these various Parkinson's foundations very nicely. All of the scientists involved in this have her as a co-author on the scientific papers. She has a TEDx talk about this. So she's like a major star. And then it turns out she's got a whole new realm where one would want to clone her. Experimentally, she and this physician flew off to Tanzania at one point to go to a tuberculosis clinic. Tuberculosis, a tidal wave of cases killing lots and lots of people in the developing world, including in Tanzania. And could she smell cases of tuberculosis before they had officially diagnosed it? Yes. And here's the frosting on top. Normally, the standard clinical practice in a place like Tanzania is you detect tuberculosis from samples using giant pouch rats, these huge rats who have this insanely good sense of smell. You could train them to be able to detect the smell of tuberculosis. I was very disappointed. I had previously been familiar with something called jumping Malagasy giant rats, who they used more in Mozambique to be able to do this sort of thing. And you would be totally creeped out in principle by these giant jumping rats. But if you look at them, giant Malagasy jumping rats, they're adorable. And all you want is for them to leap into your arms so you could tickle their bellies. But in this case, they were using a related species with a super fine sense of olfaction, and she was outperforming these rats. And since then, it begins to look like she may be able to smell, distinguish people with or without Alzheimer's disease. And at this point, a big medical ethics issue comes up, which is she's just walking down the street and somebody walks past her and she smells that they have this disease. Should she stop this perfect stranger and say, I have hereditary hyperosmia, so you better believe me here. You've got this disease coming soon. Go check. What's she supposed to do? And there was actually a precedent for this exact same quandary, which is if you do brain imaging in a psychology department and you get volunteers to come in and you're giving them some interesting puzzles to solve while you're looking at their brain, and you notice an incidental finding in one of these individuals, they got a brain tumor. Do you tell them that? And there's a whole protocol with this by now, which is you send the brain scan to a neuroradiologist. And if they agree with you, you let the person know. It's actually always struck me, this is a fantasy of mine that would bring up the exact same thing, which is I'm in like some movie theater after the movie has ended, and I'm in the bathroom at the urinal, and somebody's standing next to me, and I'm listening to them pee, which is what I always do. I don't know why. But if you hear they've got a weird flow pattern, halting or whatever, should you tell them that they have the starts of prostate cancer? I have no idea what that would do to your urine flow or if this is likely to happen. But the same issue, if you have one of these superpowers or you got a brain scanner and you could pick up evidence of this disease, should you let people know? And she is struggling with this, and it's not at all clear what she should do. So that's this woman who could smell people with Parkinson's disease, who could smell people who apparently are not going to get Parkinson's for years.
So there's a similar phenomenon which we touched on some episodes ago, which is that some dogs seem to be able to detect seizures in advance or can seemingly smell cancer in humans. Is this the same mechanism as with joy, or are these different routes towards this sort of olfactory detection?
Maybe the same, which is my saying, I don't know. But what is known is that other species, like dogs, like other primates, have way more genes devoted to coding for olfactory receptors than we humans do. So, insofar as Joy Milne's profile might possibly involve some unique genetic stuff coding for these olfactory receptors, it's at least in the ballpark of the same explanation.
Now, Ben Zut from Hong Kong asks, why does the ratio between brain to body mass matter for intelligence? I thought the same brain can control bigger or smaller limbs the same way, like a computer controlling machinery.
In principle, that's exactly how it should work. And Benz, your metaphor there is great. You get a computer with a 16-inch screen or a 24-inch screen, and the innards of the computer is not going to be bigger for the 24-inch one. It's the same innards, exactly as you suggest. But we are not computers. We are not, and resist and screw you, Claude. What you see instead in biological organisms is the whole body gets bigger, the organs typically get bigger. Big surprise, the heart of an elephant, the brain of it is a lot bigger than you find in a mouse. Yeah, as the entire size of organisms, as their mass, as their volumes get bigger, all the organs tend to increase in size as well. But there's an interesting thing in that it's not a linear correlated increase in size among all these organisms. Different organisms grow bigger at different rates. And this is something called allometry. And this taps into this mathematical relationship. It's called the square cube rule, which is as an organism gets bigger, more surface area, more volume, that's usually a number that's cubed. Their muscle mass is only squared. What does that mean? As you're dealing with a bigger organism, you need more and more muscle mass in order for them to get by. So, for example, all sorts of science fiction movies with a 30-foot tall fly, and it can't be because of allometry. So I got out my ruler and I Googled pictures of flies and elephants from face on, and very, very roughly, the leg of a fly is about 1/20th the width of a fly's torso. Whereas in an elephant, its leg is about a third the size. What that tells you is if you were going to have a 30-foot tall fly, its legs would have to be like 5, 10 feet thick, and that would be the least of its problems. It couldn't fly, it couldn't walk up the sides of walls because, interestingly, as you get a bigger and bigger organism, there's this transition. For an elephant, the world is about gravity. For a fly, the world is about texture. It's about friction on the surface of the walls it's walking on. Okay, so allometry is now going to play out here. And what you see indeed is with larger bodies, you get larger brains. That's all you need to know if you're an allometrist doing your scholarly work, measuring the width of things on Google Images. If you're a neurobiologist, though, this stops you in your tracks. Wait, the brain gets bigger? What gets bigger in the brain? What is there more of? And amid there being more of a lot of stuff as people get bigger, what you mostly see is an increase in the number of neurons. Aha, I say bitterly, does this suggest that tall people have more neurons and thus are smarter? No, this is not the case. What the explanation is as you have bigger humans, there's more muscle fibers. And more muscle fibers means more motor neurons up in the brain that project down to the fibers. It happens any given motor neuron projects to a bunch of fibers. Any given fiber is getting projections from a bunch of neurons. And what you see is with a bigger organism, with more muscle mass, you got to have more of these neurons in the motor cortex. And in addition, you got to have more neurons coding for skin receptors, tactile receptors, because you're bigger, you got more surface area of skin. So that's probably what's going on. And of course, this begins to explain one of the great misinterpreted findings out there, the fact that on the average, male brain size is about 10% bigger than female brain size, probably the same exact explanation.
So, does this explain why Neanderthals had larger brains than humans?
Yeah, Neanderthals had larger brains, about 10% bigger than modern humans. And whoa, we're certainly not all set to think of them as smarter than us. What do you see? Neanderthals were short and stocky and probably not nasty and brutish, but best estimates are they had much greater muscle mass. That's probably what was going on.
To wrap up, Aaliyah says, You've previously spoken about the biological underpinnings of religiosity. I'm curious to know your thoughts on ritualized acts of self-flagellation observed in some Christian and Muslim sects, and whether they may also have an evolutionary explanation.
Self-flagellation. Okay, we jump into the deep end. There's all sorts of religious traditions where people self-flagellate, whip with metal tips or chains and flagellating on the back. But as mentioned here, the standard versions are Christians, and by these days, in the last centuries, overwhelmingly just Catholics, or Shiite Muslims. Christians, 13th century, there were bands of flagellates. The flagellate processions of a whole bunch of believers would march through town, flagellating themselves, beating themselves, and beating like skin torn up, blood all over the place. One pope decided this was kind of creepy and tried to get people to stop doing this. Mind you, this was roughly around the same time that the church was encouraging all sorts of nuns to starve themselves to death, miraculous anorexia mirabilis. But nonetheless, this pope took exception to this, and that suppressed it for a while. Along came the Black Death, and back came self-flagellation ceremonies. Like, hey, you're willing to try anything. And it still exists. It still occurs in a lot of corners of Catholicism. Annual self-flagellation ceremonies, very popular in Mexico, Latin America, in Spain, in the Philippines. And this still happens. What it is mostly about, one would assume, is marching through town doing this to yourself. Is it's meant to be some sort of virtue signaling. You don't do it in private. However, the evidence is pretty good that Pope John Paul II did some self-flagellation, always behind closed doors. Okay, so that's the Catholic picture of it. The Muslim picture is you see self-flagellation among Shiite Muslims. And this is part of a ceremony of grief, of loss. And this commemorates the death, the killing, the murder of Hussein ibn Ali, Muhammad's grandson, where there was a horrible succession fight going on. And before it was over with, he, on the losing side, had been stabbed, an arrow shot into his lips, hit over the head, and eventually beheaded. So these ceremonies are to mark, to vicariously empathize with the pains that Ali had to go through. So this is most definitely a Shiite ceremony. It is most definitely not a Sunni ceremony where it's just beyond question that you don't do stuff like that. And I actually found one Sunni website where they speculate that those filthy, rotten Shiite Muslims and those filthy, rotten Catholics both still do the self-flagellation stuff because they're teaming up together to gang up on the Sunnis. How about is it still continuing among Shiite Muslims in more sophisticated, more cosmopolitan outposts? You don't see it anymore, but out in the boondocks, it is very much still there. So, turns out this is not just for them, and this is not just self-flagellation. There's all sorts of other religious ceremonies where you do pretty bruising things to your body. There's circumcision, of course. There's scarification ceremonies. There's tattooing. Some of these make flagellation look like small potatoes. There's ones where people, and I think this is mostly in Southeast Asia, will push a sword through their cheek and out the other side of the other cheek. There's eye-popping ceremonies where this is quite literal. People who swallow glass during religious ceremonies, who take a axe and axe the front of their face open, all sorts of these things. And of course, there's some where people are actually crucified. And when I say some of these traditions involve crucifixion, I am not kidding. Southeast Asia, you will have people where there's nails driven through their hands and through their ankles, and you get participants in it who play centurions who carry out the crucifixion. And I was very amused to see this picture of this centurion who's about to participate in the ceremony taking a selfie that celebrates the Golden State Warriors. This is a strange globalization, but what do you expect? And it is not just Shiite Muslims and Catholic Christians. You see this in some other outpost of religiosity. Apparently, Hindus, Tamil Hindus in Sri Lanka, have a whole bunch of self-mutilation ceremonies that are carried out. An interesting thing with Orthodox Jews, you do not beat yourself into bruised scarification, but each year at the holiest day of the year, Yom Kippur, people at some point have the ceremony where they're supposed to beat their chest going through, I have sinned, I have sinned, I have sinned. You're not doing major beating there. It's very lightly touching. So the irony is that all this self-mutilation stuff is ritualistic, is symbolic. So in the Orthodox Jewish world, you do a ritualistic symbolic version of the ritualistic symbolic stuff that the folks are doing who are like popping their eyes out. So what's my opinion about this? Like, no surprise, this is kind of stressful to read about this stuff. But then I do, cultural relativism saying, okay, don't be repelled by this. This is culturally specific for these people. Take their perspective on things. As you see this, you have to view the intensity, the faith with which they are bringing to these rituals. So I would look at a picture of someone who's about to run a sword through his cheeks and I had this kind of under control. And then you turn the page, and the next one is the sword has come out the other end. And at that point, my stomach lurches and I get out of there. And so much for this cultural relativism. But of course, the question becomes, why did these ceremonies evolve? And there's a lot of ritual ceremonies that involve putting bodies and souls through some pretty bruising stuff. There's religious traditions of fasting to extreme extents. There's martyrdom as sort of the biggest version of it. You think about it, if you want to frame it this way, spending your entire life thinking that you were destined for hell because of original sin that you were born with, that's kind of bruising as well. Where do these ceremonies come from? Where does this self-flagellation itself? And obviously, one element of it is this is for repentance. This is for sins you have committed. This is to purify away your sins by pain. Turns out there's a problem with that, though, in that in a lot of these traditions of horrible mutilation, people are in some sort of transcendent state and they say they don't actually feel the pain. So you're not feeling the pain that you're supposed to suffer now for the sins you carried out. Nonetheless, that's one of the pieces of it. In Catholicism, there's this whole extra level of very literal, metaphorical confusion about what Christ and his body went through in the crucifixion. And a lot of these are mortification ceremonies of evoking the pain that Jesus's body had to go through. And there's a lot of ceremonies that are doing metaphorical stuff around Jesus and the crucifixion. You eat wafers in communion, standing for the body of Christ, wine as the blood of Christ. There's a lot of that stuff there. And of course, it's not by chance, despite Pope John Paul II, that these are usually done as very public displays. This is virtue signaling. This is a means to let everybody else know you really mean it. You're in this big time. Now, in terms of the evolution of it, I think what we're seeing here is one of those evolutionary mismatches where our minds, our cultures have evolved at a faster pace than our brains have. What do I mean by this? We humans have come up with all sorts of metaphors. You can feel somebody else's pain. You could feel moral disgust. And there hasn't been enough time for our brains to catch up and evolve a new part of the brain that does psychic pain, or a new part of the brain that does the repulsion you feel, a moral repulsion. Instead, in the last 20,000 years, the brain is improvised, and a part of your brain that does literal pain also does psychic pain, also does feeling somebody else's pain. And extraordinarily, there's neurons in there that can't tell the difference between literal pain that you were feeling and the metaphorical pain that you were feeling for somebody else, which is why somebody else's pain can be so painful. And in the realm of moral disgust, you don't have a part of the brain that does moral disgust. Instead, you got the part of the brain that does gustatory disgust, disgusting tastes and smells of rotten food. It also does moral disgust. The literal, in this case, now being used in a metaphorical way, there's neurons in that part of the brain, something called the insular cortex, that cannot tell the difference between gustatory, sensory disgust, disgusty, rotten, fetid food, and a rotten, fetid moral act, which is why it could be so disturbing, so galvanizing when you hear about some of the moral transgressions that some people do. And I think what you got going on here is some sort of connection, the portal that a lot of religions have in kind of confusing the literal with the metaphorical and the connection between the two. And I think in this case, what you have, these ceremonies of making your body pained for the sins that you have committed, for the vicarious attachment you were having to what was suffered by martyrs before you, is some kind of connection here between your moral blemishes and your physical ones. This whole view that is held for an awful lot of time that illness, blemishes, abnormalities in appearance are punishment for sins that you carried out, or if it's happened when you were a fetus that your parents carried out. There's a strong connection seen between the two. And in some sort of way, it's connecting this literal metaphorical confusion in thinking that inflicting physical pain on yourself is somehow purifying of psychic spiritual pain. It's that confusion we make. And before you know it, if you did some rotten things, it seems to make perfect sense that you're beating yourself over the back in some sort of ritual of pain.
And that is all for episode 103. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.